All right, I see that it's already nearly 7:05. I am going to get going because some of our speakers have prior commitments that they need to. I'll get going with the discussion now, but I just wanted to also add, don't run away at the end because we are going to be handing out a book prize, and my colleague Mel Murcott is going to be dealing with that at the end of the event, so don't go away too quickly. For those who haven't met me yet, I'm Kate Handley. I'm an environmental attorney with Cullinan and Associates in Cape Town. I'm also the Western Cape representative for the Environmental Law Association. So this evening, I'm going to jump right in, and our first speaker that I would like to introduce you to is Maria Antonia Tigre. She is the Director of Latin America for the Global Network for the Study of Human Rights and the Environment. Through the Global Network, she has increasingly focused her efforts on human rights-based climate litigation in Latin America. She is also a coordinator of the Human Rights Group with a particular focus on ecological rights for the Global Pandemic Network, which is a community of scholars created to debate legal aspects associated with pandemics. Maria Antonia is currently completing her doctorate in juridical science at Pace University in New York. So to start off the discussion this evening, I'm going to address the question to all our speakers, but Maria Antonia, you're up first. Given your particular area of expertise, what impacts or issues in the film stood out for you the most and why?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here and chatting to you about this film. It's a really interesting initiative and really a first for me. But I'm very glad to see that it focused on Colombia. So, my research has traditionally focused on the Amazon region, and obviously Colombia is part of that. And it was really interesting to see how the communities there in not the Amazon forest, but different forests within the country are also trying to understand this relationship that they have with the lands and trying to change their own behaviors to respond to the environmental degradation that we face. So I think what really stood out for me is how we can see throughout so many different communities how the people are trying to understand this relationship a little better, sort of this human nature relationship. And I think that's something that's particularly important now that we're starting to recover from a pandemic, which was likely brought by environmental degradation as a zoonotic disease. So we have this opportunity now to rethink this a little bit. And I think the movie shows that perfectly well.
Thanks so much, Maria Antonia. I actually just before this event saw a post about how today is actually Earth Overshot Day. So it's the day by which we have used all the Earth's resources for a particular calendar year, which is quite alarming. But I agree that, the one thing the pandemic has really brought to the fore is the importance of preserving biodiversity. And as you've raised, COVID is a zoonotic disease, and I think it's really created a platform for more of these discussions. But I would like to ask the same question of our next speaker, who's Delme Cupido. Delme is the Southern African Hub Director for Natural Justice. He's a human rights lawyer with more than 18 years experience in the advancement of human rights and governance in Southern Africa. Delme has worked extensively with the issues in communities which natural justice is concerned with, particularly indigenous and local communities in Southern Africa. And he has a long and close relationship with the organization and a deep commitment to the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities who face the brunt of the onslaught against nature and the environments that sustain them. So Delme, what were the issues that stood out for you the most and why?
Thanks, Kate. Thank you, everyone. And just to say, it's a great honor for me to be here and to be with such esteemed colleagues from around the world. I mean, I think the issues that stood out are sort of, I think some of the issues that Maria Antonia mentioned, you know, and again, from a sort of professional point of view, it's the ways in which the community kind of resists extractive processes and so on. But the thing that actually struck me was not so much the issues, but there's a phrase that one of the people that the interview uses where he talks about the harmonic relationship between the community and people and nature. And as someone that has something of an amateur sort of musical ambitions, I just like the idea of that as an image. I just find it really poignant because, you know, harmony, there's a friend of mine who always says that harmony requires difference. And if you don't have that kind of difference, you know, you can't really make music. And I think to extend the metaphor slightly, maybe to stretch it, I think also it speaks to the idea of the kind of diversity that I think particularly indigenous people bring to the world. And diversity, I think, is also one of those issues that we struggle with as a country in South Africa. We struggle with it, I think, globally. So that's really what kind of jumped out at me was just that idea and how the journey that they go through and you know, the project around the music, how that all kind of comes together and speaks to that idea. So I thought that was really sort of beautiful and poignant. Sorry, not a really answer, but.
I think that was beautifully put, and it's certainly something that has stood out for me in the last year, is just the increasing global discourse around that need for diversity and that need to recognize that particular knowledge systems are not the only knowledge systems, and that there are different ways of doing things, and indigenous communities hold so much of that knowledge that if we're going to do something about the sixth mass extinction, then we need to harness that and we need to access that. So thank you. That also resonated with me in watching the film. Then our third speaker this evening is David Tshidzumba, who is an environmental activist for Save Our Limpopo Valley Environment. He is the chairperson of the Solve Youth Brigade and is also part of the Vembe Biosphere Network Steering Committee. His work centers on environmental education, capacity building in local communities, and engaging the youth in environmental issues. David holds a bachelor's degree in environmental sciences. So David, I would like to ask you as well, what really struck you about this film and the issues it addressed?
Thank you, Kate. First and foremost, thank you for giving me this opportunity to be part of something really big and really awesome, if I have to say. And I'm really, really honored to be among my esteemed colleagues from around the globe. So the thing that stood out for me was the spiritual connection that the communities have with the forest. During the movie, you could, one of the speakers mentioned the harmonious relationship that exists between the community and the forest. And in terms of saying that as a community living near those indigenous forests, they have seen or listened to the spirit of the forest when they listen to the sounds, the movement of the waves, the tides, the relationship between the moon and the tides and the water as well. So for me, that showed a spiritual connection, a spiritual element that is often overlooked when we speak about these things, or when we, for an example, do research on indigenous communities. So for me, it shows an attachment to the land. So it's people who know their identity and they see the value beyond extractive purposes, beyond extractive processes and beneficiations of minerals, but then they understand the essence of what it means to exist in such an environment. So for me, that really stood out for me, and it was really amazing to watch. Not only that it's only happening in there, but in many indigenous communities around the world, that is one thing that would always come out when you interact and you get to learn about their cultures, their traditions, and the relationship they have with their landscape and environment. So yeah, that's what really stood out for me.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. That really, I mean, it's wonderful to have someone like you who is part of that community and who's working at the coalface of these issues to share that perspective, which I agree is so often overlooked. It's not something that is incorporated really into any traditional EIA process. It's hardly given any recognition, and certainly speaks to the kind of transformative change that well, I think is probably necessary if we're going to deal with rapid biodiversity loss. But our final speaker this evening is Dr. Kawika Winter, who is a multidisciplinary ecologist who has focused his research and professional career on large-scale biocultural restoration of social ecological systems in Hawaii. His particular areas of interest include the revival of indigenous resource management. After serving for more than a decade as the director at Limahuli Garden and Preserve on the island of Kauai, he is now the reserve manager at the Heia National Estuarine Research Reserve on Oahu. Kawika also holds a faculty position at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology and is an affiliate of the Faculty of Natural Resources and Environmental Management, both at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Dr. Winter is also a research associate with the National Tropical Botanical Garden. And that was a lot of Hawaiian words in there, so I hope I have done some of them justice. But Dr. Winter, I would love to ask you the same question and hear what your perspectives were about, or perspectives that you gleaned from the film.
Okay, well, I will thank you for this invitation, and aloha from Hawaii. I believe I am on the opposite end of the planet from most of the people on this call today. I'm in Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific, the most remote landmass on the face of the planet. It is 7:15 a.m. over here, and so what it looks like the sun is setting for you folks, the sun is rising over here. So I mentioned that because I think the organizers of this panel have done a very good job of bringing together a global perspective of this issue, and so I appreciate that. As far as the thing that struck me the most out of the film, I myself am not an aspiring musician, but I do have a deep appreciation for music. But I think the thing that struck me the most is that these people live with their forest. They don't live apart from their forest. And I think that's the thing that humanity needs to figure out in the Anthropocene, is how do we live with our forests? Because for the past, since the Industrial Revolution, so it's been a good 200 years now, humanity has expanded and forests have contracted. And that's a big reason why we're in the situation we are today. I think we need to, I believe that humanity needs to look to the cultures that still know how to live with their forests and adopt those practices in the contemporary period. And so much of what I do as an ecologist is I use science to translate indigenous wisdom into a language that policymakers can understand and act on. And so I think it's really important that this film highlighted two perspectives, right? Because within the realm of policy, we have, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term indigenous people in local communities. And that's exactly what this film highlighted. It highlighted an indigenous community and a local community that, they've been there 400 or 500 years at this point. So they might even be considered indigenous to that place, even though they're escaped slaves. But a lot of my work, we look at indigeneity not as a function of race, more of a function of longevity in and relationship to place. And this film highlighted two different communities who have deep relationships to their place. Even that last group of indigenous people that wasn't even their ancestral forest. They were forced to move into that forest because of what the film called dark economic forces. I think we all know what that means. But yet they were still adapting. They're living in a new forest and figuring it out. And that gives us hope because we need to figure it out. For those of us who aren't living in a forest that our ancestors did, we still need to figure it out. How do we honor the forest in the ways that these people do and that Hawaiians do and people all over the world do? So I think it's a really great highlight of how we could do that in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kawika. It's really valid points that you raise. And I mean, you speak about policy, and I think that's something that I find quite interesting and why I really enjoy being an attorney. Is law and policy it's a sort of a reactive and proactive thing. Like law changes the way people behave and also is reactive to societal change that requires law to move in a particular direction. And I certainly think that living with nature is largely not reflected in our legal system and in our way of relating to the planet. And that's just something that, I think probably needs to change. But that I would actually like to direct a further question to Maria Antonia around that. And that is given the role that the film recognizes of indigenous communities in safeguarding biodiversity, do you think that there is sufficient recognition given to this in international law? And what are the key legal obligations in this regard?
Thank you, Kate, for this question. So Indigenous people have for long fought for recognition of basic human rights that I think in the international realm, we have failed to provide that to them for many, many decades. There's been really a long process to get to where we're at, so having this sort of broad international framework for their protection. And the main issue is that the implementation is really slow. So, for example, there was a landmark case at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on the rights of indigenous people in Argentina. It was really unprecedented as it was very progressive. It provided for the right to water, the right to food, the right to a healthy environment and to cultural identity. It was really sort of advertised as being a very progressive decision that sort of changed the status quo of indigenous rights. But it's interesting to think about how this case actually started 20 years ago. And we're still going to have, at least 5 years of implementing that decision. So if you think of the social justice, environmental justice aspect of that, it's really insufficient what we have right now. And with that insufficient protection of indigenous peoples and their lands, the environment also suffers because indigenous peoples are really the people who mostly safeguard the forests, sort of the guardians of the forest, so to speak. There was a recent article by the former special rapporteur on human rights and the environment, John Knox, and Victoria Tali-Kopu, the prior special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, noting the role of indigenous communities in biodiversity protection. So calling to actually have them included in the international discussions on the Convention on Biological Diversity, and really emphasizing how the best way to protect nature is to protect the human rights of those who live within nature. And as really the remaining natural ecosystems that we have are largely found on the lands of indigenous peoples. But the assault on them is still ongoing, and especially now with the pandemic, it's something that really increased even more, and we have even less protection. But I think we're really in sort of a crucial moment in these discussions because, like I mentioned, as a zoonotic disease, COVID-19 really emphasizes this role of biodiversity protection in protecting human health as well, from everyone. So those of us who live in cities and are far away from the Amazon rainforest or any other type of forest. So this protection is really important if you want to avoid this pandemic to happen in the future. And like I said, really, it's an opportunity to reflect on that and analyze how the constant pressure that we put on the limited resources that we have on the planet have really led to this natural crisis. and, you know, adopting a stronger right to indigenous territory in tandem with a right to a healthy environment and indigenous rights in general could really help secure indigenous rights and provide and better safeguard nature in that respect.
Thanks so much. That's a very comprehensive answer to the question. And I'd actually like to firstly just say that the chat is already on fire. So please feel free to engage. We have a lot of questions and 4 very interesting speakers to get through this evening. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to all the questions in the chat in the discussion time that we have. So please feel free to continue engaging on that function. But just flowing from Maria Antonia's answer, I wanted to ask Delme, from a South African perspective, and given the laws that we have here, do you think that there is any or sufficient recognition in South African law for indigenous communities and their role in biodiversity protection? Or do you think that this is an area where we are in particular need of reform?
Thanks. I mean, I'm almost tempted to sort of stop the question at the word indigenous, in the sense that, you know, is there enough recognition for indigenous people, period, in South Africa? Which I think it's fair to say really isn't the case, and you know, until the recent passage of the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act, there was virtually no real recognition of you know, indigenous people in South Africa, and this ties into, I think, what our colleague from Hawaii was saying. We've been struggling with your name all day. Sorry, Dr. Winter was saying about the concept of indigeneity, right? Because it's slightly more complex in South Africa than it is in Africa generally than it is in many other contexts. Because there's obviously a sense in which you know, all people in Africa of African descent are indigenous to Africa. But in the South African context, I think for the purposes of this discussion, we really mean the Khoi and the San communities by and large. And there really hasn't been much recognition of those communities as such for a whole range of historical reasons. And so to move on from that and to speak of recognition of the role of indigenous people in terms of conservation and protecting biodiversity, I think South Africa very much is playing catch up. I think we're in a very odd situation where we have more protection for indigenous peoples stemming from the international kind of framework and some of the continental frameworks than we do have from our domestic law. You know, if we confine ourselves to South Africa specifically, you know, South Africa, I think it's beginning to change. I've seen sort of sand parks make noises about including communities in conservation and so on. But I think by and large, we still follow the kind of the approach where conservation areas are areas that are fenced off. Communities are taken out of those areas, you know, and when they do go into the areas or they try to practice, you know, they sort of say traditional hunting, they get labeled as poachers, for example. So in fact, their culture gets criminalized in many ways. There's a case going on right now in the Kalahari where because of COVID and the hardships that it inflicted on the community, some of the elders on land which, just for the benefit of our colleagues who may not know this, a land claim was successful on behalf of the San people in the Kalahari, and they were given an area of land. So the land is notionally it's their land, right? But when they actually went hunting, you know, they were charged criminally, even though they've gone through a whole kind of consultative process to do it. So there's a large degree to which I think we still do not recognize the role that indigenous communities actually play and have always played in conservation and in protecting biodiversity in South Africa. And I think that goes along with the underlying question of the recognition of indigenous communities in South Africa. Because in the Constitution, when we talk about indigenous communities, there's actually a strict delineation between each sort of Black African communities, which would be, you know, your Sotho speakers, Venda speakers, and so on. So when the Constitution says indigenous, that's what it means. And it kind of explicitly excludes Khoi and San people who self-identify as indigenous. And that really trickles down in a sense, or there's a line through sort of all our legislation in terms of that sort of non-recognition. And so, yeah, I think that's something that, again, I think we as a country, we have to grapple with, and we have to, I think there's a serious need for legislative reform. And just maybe it's just as a last point, I think in South Africa, really the underlying question, I think that, you know, what people often say is the elephant in the room and all of that, is the land question, right? I mean, I think maybe at some point, if we have time and we start talking about, you know, issues of access and benefit sharing, and maybe I can talk a little bit about the Rooibos case, you know, which is a case ostensibly about, sorry about that, about access and benefit sharing, but really the underlying issue there is also about land, and you know, so if we don't recognize indigenous peoples as practically almost like being a community with a distinct identity and a relationship to the land, you know, it's difficult to see how we can actually comprehensively address a lot of the challenges that those communities face, and by extension, the environmental challenges that we face. I hope that answers the question.
Yes. No, I mean, it's really, it's just reframed. I mean, I phrased the question in a way that I gleaned from the film, and something that just struck me, but it just demonstrates how multi-layered and multifaceted these issues are. I mean, you can't begin to talk about what the law does without even thinking about where the recognition lies and whether that is even there in the first place. So I almost needed to take a step back in thinking about that question. So thank you. And I want to go a little bit into the chat, because I see that a question has been posed to Kawika around local communities versus indigenous communities. And I think that is an important distinction. And it would actually be great if you could just at this point address that particular question, because I think that would really contribute to the discussion.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you. I think it's really interesting because on this call here, we have people from the continent of Africa, where humanity was born. We have people representing South America, which is the earliest, or within the terms of the human diaspora across the world, that was a continent to be settled last. And then I'm speaking from the middle of the Pacific, where Pacific Islands were the last pieces of land to be settled by humanity. And so, how do we speak of indigeneity in a way that connects all of these places where humanity has existed from, 250,000 years ago to a place where humanity has only existed 1,000 years? And you look at all the layers of, human diaspora and migrations across the planet and over places. It gets to be very complex. And so we use this term indigenous, and I think we use it in different ways in different places of the world. And what I've found is that when we use the term indigenous, if people don't self-identify as indigenous, they already feel like they're not a part of the conversation, or they have this ancestral guilt associated with the things their ancestors did, but that they didn't have any actions in. And it starts to work against our efforts to bring people together. And so I tend to try to lean towards definitions of indigeneity that people can see themselves in. And maybe you haven't been there for 1,000 years, but maybe your family's been there for a few hundred, or maybe a few generations. And that's important, because to me, the heart of indigeneity is that relationship to place. And I speak of place as a generic proper noun. I capitalize it so that we can speak of all the places that are important to people in a general term, but yet acknowledging that each of these places has its own name and its own history and its own importance to the people of that place. And I think, in America, so we've been colonized by America here in Hawaii, and there's some holiday, I think it's called Indigenous Peoples Day or something like that. And so you have all of these non-Indigenous people trying to celebrate that day. And it's interesting how people think to do that, but in many ways it becomes this day of cultural appropriation. And I think, and it's well-intentioned, but I think they're missing the point. I think the best way to honor indigeneity is to take some time and connect with your place. Take some time to connect to the biodiversity around you. Even if you live in a city, in a highly urbanized environment, and there's a tree on the corner, take a moment to connect to the tree. And I think that's our best hope, because when we speak of the wisdom of Indigenous people and how we can apply that in our lives, if people don't feel connected to those concepts, that's not going to get us anywhere either. So I tend to be more of a bridge builder than a wall builder. And so I do speak in those generalities and try to invite people under the tent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think it's such a beautiful description again of, how each of us can find that sense of place and connect with a place and learn from that relationship with place. But I think another thing that really struck me about the film was the sort of different roles when we talk about the role of Indigenous communities in protecting biodiversity. It was very much from a proactive stance, in as much as they've lived in harmony with these environments for years. They're in touch with the biorhythms of that environment, and it's led to an inherent sustainability. But what I wanted to touch on now is also that reactive fighting against extractive industries, fighting against logging and really external threats. And I wanted to bring in David at this point and just hear about your perspectives as really being at the coalface in Limpopo and the kind of threats that you're facing there. And it'd be great if you could tell us about some of your work.
Thank you, Kate. So just to come in, we are facing a huge threat here in Limpopo, in the Delme district. We are facing a threat of a mega industrial metallurgical park that is proposed by the Chinese government with a bilateral agreement with the South African government. So this whole project is going to be mainly focusing on metallurgy. So different metals are going to be processed here, metallic ore and the works. And it is its foundation rather, or the energy that's going to be used, it's going to be coal mining. And the region as well has a lot of coal reserves that have not been yet explored. So what we are seeing, what we are seeing is that if this project is to be given the go-ahead, we are not only going to face the threat or the consequences from the 8,000 or the 6,000 hectare project or proposed site, but also the mushrooming of coal mines in the region. So we're going to have the whole Limpopo Valley, the whole Limpopo Valley is going to be destroyed. So that is what we are fighting against as SOLVE and the communities with different partners as well, because this not only threatens the environment, but it threatens the whole livelihoods of the Wavinda people, because we are still in South Africa, one of the few tribes that are still connected with our culture if we compare ourselves with the other tribes. And if you were to come to my region and see the landscape, you could see some of the landscapes, it almost looks like the Amazon rainforest. Even my backdrop, that is in the village where I am from. And you can see it's all greenery and so forth. So what we stand to lose is that if such projects come in, we're going to lose our way of life, because as a people, we have started to find ourselves. We started to self-actualize and actually take pride in our culture and our traditions, because for so long we have been separated, and this started in the colonial times, in apartheid, where our people were moved and bunched together in the homelands. And in those homelands, the movement was still restricted because you had private game farms, you had commercial plantations where people were no longer allowed to go in and access the resources that they used to go and access freely. So sacred sites, things like sacred sites, medicinal plants, all of these things now are fenced in private game farms, in private agricultural farms, and these commercial state plantations. So then that is what we are fearing. Now we've gotten our land back. With democracy, we've started to now self-actualize, take pride in our culture and our traditions. But now we're facing another threat, because this project is not only going to affect the immediate surrounding or the adjacent areas, but it's going to affect the whole region. And the region already is a water scarce area. And such a project is going to take a lot, even from the EAI processes that we were part of, the public participation meetings that we attended. Oh my goodness.
David? All right, I think we may have temporarily lost David, but the points that David was raising about the regionality of these issues segues into something else that I wanted to actually bring up with Maria Antonia, and that was your research has focused a lot on the Amazon, and ecosystems like the Amazon don't always respect political boundaries. So I wanted to hear from you, how does one facilitate regional cooperation for protection of environments that span different countries? And what kind of legal mechanisms can facilitate that, or do facilitate that?
Thank you. Yeah, I think not a lot of people know that the Amazon rainforest is shared between 9 countries. It's actually, it's a little crazy if you think about that. Nine different countries have, the responsibility for it, share the territory and the responsibility for it. And as an interconnected ecosystem, what happens on one side of the forest has effects on the other side of the border. So the Amazon countries have tried to work together for many decades now. I've been writing about this for a while. So we have a treaty called the Amazon Cooperation Treaty that's from the 1970s. And the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, which came out of that initial treaty and was created in the 1990s. So this institutional framework could theoretically provide for joint solutions for environmental problems that are shared across border, but in theory, in reality, cooperation is really hard to achieve. And the main reason is political. There's still a very strong reliance on the sovereignty of each country, and most initiatives are really seen as a threat to that sovereignty. And I think if we think about some other international environmental protection issues, it's mostly the same. If you think about the climate change regime, there's also this reliance on sovereignty and how other countries cannot impose on us that we need to change our ways of being. But I think we need to move away from that a little bit and really understand how crucial this moment is, in particular if you're talking about the protection of the Amazon rainforest. So everyone knows that Amazonia has been called the lungs of the planet. It really can act as a very important carbon sink at the global level, and the forest has traditionally absorbed greenhouse gas emissions and really in a very significant level, but this capacity is constantly diminishing. And for example, it was announced earlier this year through a very comprehensive scientific study that some parts of the Amazon are no longer acting as a carbon sink, but are rather producing more emissions. And this is something that scientists have for long talked about, but everyone thought that it was, far away in the future. So if countries work together to find, for example, financial mechanisms that can help keep the forest on the ground and restore the forests that were degraded, we could still reverse that trend. But we really need sort of the political will to do that, and obviously also ensure that there are financial mechanisms that allow the countries to do that, because most of the countries are still developing countries, have several social challenges and economic challenges that it's still more financially it makes more sense financially to actually destroy the forest and mine that area or get the oil that's underground rather than protect it for what it is and for the social environmental benefits that it provides for the world, really. So I think we do need sort of that financial aspect as a core element of ensuring that there's cooperation and that there's a joint solution to protect what's still left of the Amazon rainforest.
Thanks so much for that perspective, Maria Antonia. And I'm not sure how many people might have gone into the background of this film, but it's produced by an organization called Stand for Trees. And the idea is that Stand for Trees acts as a kind of carbon credit organization where communities benefit financially from the conservation projects that they implement on the ground. And then any third party can buy into that system and can buy a credit for the carbon saved through those projects. And it brings me to a question that I actually wanted to ask Delme, and that was around, in the past, the people when logging, in the film, were logging in the forests because that was a means to create a livelihood. And through conservation initiatives and conservation projects, they're now gaining livelihoods from that. So what kind of legal mechanisms can be used to ensure that communities do get benefits from conservation initiatives, or legal mechanisms that can be put in place to promote those kind of initiatives?
Thanks, Kate. So when I was introducing myself, I think I indicated to people that I spent a large part of my youth and my working life in Namibia, which is obviously just right next door to South Africa. And one of the things that Namibia is sort of lauded for internationally in conservation circles is the community-based natural resource management sort of approach. In Namibia, it's actually legislated. And I think we've got one of the largest, if not the largest, community-based natural resource management system in the world, with something like 70% of the country actually being under control of local communities. And the very first one of those, in fact, was a place called Nyanya, which is what they used to call Bushman land and under apartheid. So this is land that is actually under control of the local Tshidzumba San people there, and it's actually quite a very successful model in many ways. It has some problems, but as an approach, I think overall it's delivered fairly significant results, and importantly, it means that communities have a land base, which in turn allows them to practice their culture and then also to benefit from many of the resources that are theirs. And the theory behind it is essentially is that communities are the best stewards of those resources, and certainly with communities that have the kind of relationship that the San have with their land and with the environment and with the animals, plants on their lands. It's compared to the condition of sand people in other areas. So in parks and so on, where they don't have control over those resources, there's a visible difference between their kind of socioeconomic situations. So bringing that to South Africa, I mean, I think South Africa sort of has a kind of community-based natural resource management approach, but I think that's something that needs to be strengthened. And I think what South Africa can do is learn from Namibia, where it's been implemented in Namibia since 1991, roughly, because there are lessons to be learned from that, because not all of them are successful, and I think it's worthwhile to try to understand why that is. A lot of it has to do with sort of ongoing support, but some of it also has to do with the ways in which those communities are supported in their cultural practices, and the ways in which that is actually encouraged, as a way of them both protecting biodiversity and protecting the land, but also to derive an economic benefit, right? And while the people in those places are not necessarily wealthy in any sense that, kind of a Western sense, they certainly are, their culture is very much more intact, and they don't have many of the other problems that I think a lot of indigenous communities unfortunately do suffer. So I think that is, I mean, I think that's certainly one, I guess, simple thing that could be done, is just to recognize that communities are not just sort of stand communities, but local communities, such as the communities that David comes from. These are, in many instances, their sacred sites are there, and they've got practices that, that date back generations, if not centuries, where they've learned how to live, again, in harmony with their environment, and I think that would be, I think, probably for me, the single most important thing that we could do. I think there are other issues as well. Is that, again, we in South Africa, you have to come back to the land issue. I think giving people land tenure is the basis of much of this, is whether it's collective ownership or individual ownership, but for communities, it would largely be collective ownership. As you find in Namibia around sort of communal lands. I think those are some of the kind of ways that you can do that. I think we can provide disincentives for extractives. We can provide incentives to communities. I mean, there's a whole range of examples from around the world, of different communities that have been protecting the lands. I think the film speaks to some of that, but I think there's a lot that, obviously I think the people sitting in this room would largely agree that instead of sort of viewing indigenous people as impoverished and marginalized and so on, which is the language that our governments tend to use, to actually think about what we can learn from indigenous people about how to protect biodiversity, and think about how we can take some of those practices to scale, and really, in our context, I think, quite literally learn from our ancestors how to do these things.
Thanks so much, Delme. There's so many valid points there. And I mean, everything you say, it seems to keep coming back to primarily recognition. And once we have greater recognition, then being able to create incentives for community-based resource management and other such initiatives is really key. But we are running out of time, and I really wanted to address one more question to Dr. Kawika Winter, particularly about your role in the revival of Indigenous resource management. And just flowing from what Delme said, how can that be used to leverage both ecological benefits and benefits for people? And how are you doing that in Hawaii?
Yeah, you mean how are we saving the world in Hawaii? Yeah. So yeah, ultimately, so what I've found is we put things in the terms of biocultural restoration. I'm not sure if that's a buzzword that has reached the other side of the planet yet, but biocultural restoration is a term that we use that recognizes the inherent connection between humanity and nature. We seem to have been colonized by a worldview that sees us as superior to nature or separate from nature. That isn't the way we think here in Hawaii. This isn't the way our ancestors thought. So we use terms like biocultural to recognize that there is a connection, and we use the term restoration so that we can speak of ways to heal the relationship between people in place and people in biodiversity. You know, the process of colonization, if you look at it from a distance and separate yourself from the pain, it's a process of severing relationships between people in place, between people and ancestors, between people in biodiversity, between families. And so we speak of biocultural restoration as a way to heal all of the wounds in our system by reconnecting to nature. And so and reviving that connection and making it vibrant again. And through that connection, people have a vested interest in protecting their places and protecting the biodiversity of their places. And then if we can translate that into policy, we can have some broader scale effects on large landscape scales. So I'll leave it there because we're almost out of time, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Kawika. And that is a wonderful explanation. And I want to jump into, in the last couple of minutes that we have, just one more question for David, which kind of stems from that, speaking about the connection. I see there was a question posed in the chat by Brandon about the spiritual connection to land, and how do you see this being conveyed into the sterile, technical, and formal types of EIA and heritage assessment processes that really dominate the legal framework at the moment?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Brandon. I would say that it's important that we recognize these aspects that are largely not recognized. And as the previous speakers have said, it stems down to the characterization of these communities and their value or knowledge systems. So for a very long time, these knowledge systems have been deemed insufficient or backwards. But then right now in the sector, what we are seeing is that these new conservation strategies actually have similarities or have their roots based on what these indigenous communities have been doing for centuries. So I would say that it would also, the current stage of recharacterization of such is needed so that it can become more mainstream, and it can also be integrated into our environmental impact assessments. Because when we look at this, the heritage, when they talk about heritage, they would only talk about ancestral graves. They do not talk about the sacred sites. Those sacred sites, if they do talk about it, it's not properly defined. So if it's not properly defined, it means that we are not understanding the whole, or we don't have a holistic understanding of what a sacred site means to indigenous communities. Because if you look at it, a sacred site is more than just an ancestral grave. It could be a spring, and a spring could have different meaning to a different family, to a different clan. So all of these nuances would need to be looked into and understood so that we could have meaningful inclusion and meaningful participation when we have EAIs being conducted. So that will go a long way in understanding the plight of these communities and understanding the attachment that they have to their land and the environments and the various aspects of their tradition and culture. So we need to really, as scientists as well, we would also need to go back and redefine these things, and also in our way of research, how we research and how we view information coming from these communities. And that would go a long way in ensuring that these communities have a voice, their way of life is recognized and is mainstream. That way they can have a meaningful participation. Yeah.
Thanks so much, David, for that great response. And I think it really does go to the heart of the sterile and technical formalities that we have in the EIA process, and how there's just no latitude for proper assessments of intangible heritage or any of the aspects that you've spoken of, and how that really needs to be integrated in order to facilitate meaningful decision making. We're now right out of time, and I'm very conscious of our speakers, and particularly Dr. Winter, having to go to another conference now. So there's so many different topics that we could discuss, and I actually wish that we had another 2 hours to really get into them. But I've seen some wonderful comments being made in the chat, and I hope that at least there've been connections made, and that these discussions can continue outside of this particular forum. But for now, I would just like to say thank you so much again to our speakers. It's really wonderful to have such a diversity of views and representation here tonight. Thank you for everyone else for your questions and for participating. I do just want to encourage anyone who isn't an ELA member, please do join. We host events like this. We have a weekly newsletter. It's a constant source of information and engagement around environmental law issues. And please feel free to email either Melanie or myself about membership.